What happens when one man tries to watch every horror film from the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project. On this show, we are working our way through all of the horror films of the 1980s, and we're working our way through the year 1980 here. Each year's gonna take about a year of videos worth to cover. I believe that 1980 has 9 or 10 episodes that are going to cover it, and this is episode 6, so you can see that this is going to be a rather massive project indeed. But let's take a look to see what the latter half of 1980 looks like. This block kicks off on September 19th with Without Warning from Graydon Clark, director of the classic Satan's Cheerleaders. It starts with B-movie legend Cameron Mitchell as a hunter who then gets attacked by these little flying potato pancakes. And then, stop me if you've heard me say this before, a group of teenagers are headed into the woods for a hiking trip. And hey, look, it's baby David Caruso in one of his very first film roles. And he's wearing shorts along with a hooded sweatshirt, I guess to keep his upper body heated while his legs go without warming. Bela Lugosi is also here to pull the strings, and before you can say, come back, Shane is here, and this is 2 years before these two would also co-star in Alone in the Dark together. Things get a little wacky when compasses start to malfunction, and this gets full of old school cred as Larry Storch shows up and is also killed. And just for reference, this is a movie with Cameron Mitchell, Jack Palance, Martin Landau, and Larry Storch in it, and if that sentence excites you like it did me, congratulations, it's time for your back pills. When the group starts to get whittled down, they seek shelter in the town, and after some time, we finally get a good look at our alien menace, and it's a pretty cool suit. The head of the creature was actually designed by Rick Baker and cost a pretty solid chunk of the budget. The rest of the creature effects were by Greg Canham, so there's so many heavy hitters from the FX world here too. It's revealed that the alien after them is some sort of hunter, and he's on Earth in search of game, and he keeps the bodies as trophies. And if that sounds familiar, it's because this film was cited as a rather big inspiration for Predator, which is appropriate because under that alien suit is Kevin Peter Hall, the actor who portrayed the Predator. My rating here is a 3 because it starts off really strong and the ending is pretty fun and there's some great stuff in there, but man, the middle chunk of this movie is kinda dull. Its horror cultural significance is higher though at a 3.5 since it features so many big faces, a starting point for David Caruso, and some big FX guys at play, plus its direct influence on Predator. I would have given it a 4 were it not for the fact that it's still not a widely known film and kind of a cult thing. Should you watch it? Yep, you should. Some good stuff going on here, even if it drags a bit. Alien! Our next movie doesn't have a definitive date, but it came out sometime in October of 1980, and it's Schizoid, which was written and directed by David Paulson, who would move entirely into TV producing and directing after this, and had his hands in the final seasons of Dynasty. It begins with a woman on a bike being chased down by someone in a car who then stalks her and kills her. Julie here is getting threatening notes in the mail, and she works with Doug, played by Dr. Gordon, who also happens to be her recently ex-husband. Reverend Jim is also here, and damn, so is the Nosferatu, and I am 2 movies into this block and it is just star-studded. Pieter here is a doctor and his daughter is an angel, and Julie is one of his patients. Julie definitely has some issues because this is her reaction to a black man getting on the elevator with her. And of course, she thinks he's following her and wants to attack her, even though dude just wants to hook up with the guy across the hall, proving that Karens have been eternal. The doc is inappropriate with his patients, and apparently his on-set behavior matched, as Flo Lawrence stated that he crossed the line in their scene and was touching her in places she was uncomfortable with, and was shocked that no one yelled cut or admonished him afterwards. He was also apparently having an affair with Donna Wilkes, his on-screen daughter, and an actress over 30 years younger than him. Co-stars claim that they suspected and that there may have been rough treatment with Wilkes showing up for filming with black and blue marks on her. Kinski discussed their fling in his book but changed her name, although the details he laid out made it pretty blatantly obvious who he was talking about. But Wilkes has never discussed the issue or confirmed it. Linda and Pieter start seeing each other, which creates tension, but who's crazy? Who's the schizoid? Who's after Julie? And who's killing the doctor's patients? Is it the doctor himself? The daughter? Fester? The jealous ex? This actually did quite well in its release, and there's no official numbers, but it's been reported that it grossed over $4 million against a budget of around $350,000. It wasn't well received by critics, though, who called it underwhelming and decried its pointed violence towards women. My rating on this one is a 2.5, since it just kind of feels by the numbers, and there's not much slashing going on for a slasher flick, and it seems so intent on making everyone a suspect that it forgets to make any of them likable, although it's pretty watchable. Its significance is a 2, since it's not well remembered, doesn't break any new ground, although it does get a little more of a score here for its star power. Should you watch it? Possibly. It's not a bad flick, it does some fun things, but there's just not enough of it, really.
You shaved your afro, I don't believe it! Suits you, it does. It really does. When did you do that?
Another one that has a sort of nebulous date is Toxic Zombies, which apparently came out sometime in US theaters on a limited basis sometime in October, although it may have played France as early as May. It starts with a classy bit with a police raid and this woman is running away, so the officers just straight up shoot her, like she's not armed or anything and she's running away from you. So there's a group of people running an illegal marijuana farm, and the federal agents, including freaking Martin, are so worried about this crop of weed getting out that they decide to spray the area with this new experimental herbicide that may be toxic to humans. There's a government man who normally works in the area, played by Charles McCran, who also wrote, directed, and produced the film and made sure to give himself a sex scene. They end up spraying the area and the growers, which of course turns the people who are exposed to it into ghouls that I guess lick rocks? There's a family out there as well, including Jimmy, who has a learning disability, and these zombies use weapons, and the groups in the woods try to figure out what's going on. Shot on a pretty low budget somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, this one actually holds the distinction of kicking off an entire subgenre. After this, movies about chemical spills out in the sticks turning rednecks and yokels into zombies became a bit of a thing. It also earned a place as one of the video nasties, getting itself banned in the UK, which is pretty hilarious if you actually watch it and see how low-key and silly the effects look. This would be the only film that McCran would make, and afterwards he would go to work in the finance industry, becoming a pretty top-level executive for Marsh & McLennan. He went to work at their offices in New York and the World Trade Centers and was sadly killed in the 9/11 attacks. The ending of the film borrows pretty heavily from Night of the Living Dead, with everyone in a house and some tension with a man who's already there, but here the zombies have the torches. My rating on this one is a 3. I liked it. I like its vibe. It's not a good movie per se, but it gave me a nostalgic feeling I can't quite describe that made me happy. Its HCS is a bit lower though, at a 2.5, because although it's not hugely remembered, it sets the stage for a dozen redneck zombie style flicks to come and made it on the nasty list. Should you watch it? Yeah, I would. It's pretty fun. Our next entry is another one that came out in October with an unspecified date, and it's Dr. Heckyl and Mr. Hype, which was directed by Charles B. Griffith, who only directed a small handful of films, but wrote a ton, including the original Little Shop of Horrors. It's got the great Oliver Reed, the Brood Doctor himself, as Dr. Heckyl, who's this kinda horrible looking dude with incredible Hulk hair. And damn, the music in this is by Full Moon's Richard Band, one of his earliest works, and was edited by Skip Skulnick, which is a name that any Angel fan will be familiar with. The OG Mushnik is here, and Heckyl is a foot doctor, and his appearance makes him suicidal, so when his friend gives him an experimental serum, he drinks it hoping it will kill him. Instead, it transforms him into regular Oliver Reed, and immediately starts going after the ladies. Unfortunately, he seems to have gone slightly insane as well and starts killing people. Dick Miller pops in to be awesome, and oh yeah, there's another doctor who apparently just has a clinic where he tickles people. Hype then starts to go on a crime spree and cause havoc all around town, and this was written to be a much wackier comedy, like it's pretty wacky, but there's still a bit of a serious tone due to how straight Reed is playing it. But it was intended for Dick Van Dyke to play the lead, but he wasn't available, so Reed stepped in, who had actually played a more straightforward Jekyll and Hyde earlier, and the movie was retooled to fit his persona. Hype's whole mission is to get laid and have people tell him that he's the most beautiful man that they've ever seen, and the script on this one was actually partially written by an uncredited Roger Corman and had a bit of a rough time of it. The production was rushed, with only 3 weeks given the write and prep the film, 4 weeks to shoot, and 2 weeks to edit on a budget of under $1 million. It was produced by Cannon Films, who decided they didn't want to actually release the film and instead sold it to cable TV. Griffith himself laments the film and puts quite a bit of the blame on Reed's performance, saying that although he nailed the portrayal of Heckyl, he didn't know how to do the character of Hype, and it turned the audiences off. It's also the film debut of Tony Cox in a pretty minor but memorable role. My rating on this one is just a 2, because although I respect the sheer level of talent involved in this one, it is a drag. Its significance is a touch higher though at a 2.5 due to the number of big names involved. Should you watch it? I'd go with no, but it does have its fans.
Do you know, I must tell you, Druck, these are the ugliest feet I've ever seen in my life.
Well, here's one with an actual date, because on October 2nd, there was Terror Train, probably one of the more well-known entries on this block. And it starts off with a big frat party and then lets us know that Laurie Strode is here for her second slasher film of this year. They pull a prank on one of the pledges using a corpse that causes him to freak out, and then 3 years later, once again on New Year's Eve, that same frat is having another big party, this time on a train. It's a costume party and there's a magician here, and not just any magician, David freaking Copperfield in his first film role, and the only one in which he's not just playing David Copperfield, and instead is a character simply called the Magician. The conductor is film legend Ben Johnson, and gross, Ellis is here. I hope he dies first. Well, nope, this guy does, and someone steals his Groucho costume and starts killing off partygoers rather quickly. And hey, speaking of early film appearances, this is only the second appearance of Vanity, here credited as D.D. Winters, before her rise to fame a few years later. The killer keeps swapping costumes, and this was the first directing job for Roger Spottiswoode, who had a pretty solid career in both writing and directing, and he would go on to make Turner and Hooch, the Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, and he would also make the Schwarzenegger bomb The Sixth Day, and oh, and Stop or My Mom Will Shoot. In the original script, there was no magician, which is pretty odd considering just how much the magic show factors into the movie for a while, but producer Sandy Howard loved magic, so had all that stuff written in. It was made as a clear attempt to cash in on the success of Halloween and was described as simply Halloween on a train, and they even sought out Jamie Lee because of her role in that film, which she filmed immediately after wrapping up Prom Night, although she had less disco dancing to do here. Cost around $3 million to make and got pretty mediocre reviews upon release, and made around $8 million at the box office, which sounds like it made a profit, but they reportedly spent around $5 million to market the movie, so it in actuality did not do that well. It's since become a cult classic though, perhaps only hindered by their lack of an identifiable killer. Having him constantly swap costumes works for the suspense of the film, but not for the sake of making a horror icon. My rating here is a 3.5. It's a solid slasher with a fair bit of style, but it feels a bit like the same old, and the reveal is kinda what you think, but also not what you think. I definitely like it a bit more than Prom Night, the other Curtis slasher from this year. Its HCS is the same at a 3.5 since it's often one of the more remembered slashers from the era, had that all-important Jamie Lee element, but is slightly less regarded than Prom Night, and kicked off Spottiswood's career. Should you watch it? Absolutely, it's a cool flick.
Your cigarette, and hold it up to your quarter. It'll seem to be sticking to it, just like that. And if we keep turning it, it'll look like the cigarette's penetrating the quarter, just like that.
One day later, in Canada, on October 3rd, Funeral Home was released, also known as Cries in the Night, which was the title it was released in Canada as. It was retitled to Funeral Home when it was released in the US 2 years later in 1982. It's got Heather here going to stay with her grandmother at an inn, which was previously a funeral home. Heather is played by Leslie Donaldson, who had a run of slashers around this time and will later appear in Happy Birthday to Me and Curtains. Some guests arrive, including Mickey.
Name's Morty, not Mickey.
And the inn has a handyman with a disability in Billy here. So there's a real estate man who's gone missing, and the police are sort of looking for him, like Joe here, who you also see a little while later in My Bloody Valentine. Turns out that someone is killing the guests of the inn, and this one was directed by William Fruitt, who never became a horror icon, but definitely made his share in the genre. Besides this film, he also made Spasms, Killer Party, and Blue Monkey, which has exactly 0 monkeys in it, let alone a blue one. Besides that, he's done a ton of horror TV, like a bunch of Friday the 13th series episodes, and that Poltergeist TV show. He also co-produced the Goosebumps TV show, and the house featured in this movie was also used there. There's several mysteries going on here, since you have the murders, the missing real estate agent, the whereabouts of Maud's husband, the former Undertaker, and exactly what's in the cellar that's always locked. According to Donaldson, the shoot was a difficult one, with Kat Hawtrey, the actress playing Grandma Maud, and Fruitt being constantly at odds with each other as he was asking her to perform physicalities that she was uncomfortable with doing. It did pretty well in Canada and was actually nominated for 3 Genie Awards, which was a sort of equivalent to an Oscar in Canada, although not as prestigious considering there were less films to pick from. Leslie Donaldson got a nomination for Best Actress, and it was also considered for Best Editing and Sound Editing, but didn't win any of the awards. My rating on it is a 2.5. It's a decent watch, a little slow and maybe a little too psycho-derivative. Its HCS is a 2, since there's not a ton that really made it stand out, and it didn't really have a lot of influence, and instead seemed to simply draw off of other influences. Should you watch it? I think it's nothing special, but it's still pretty enjoyable.
James, the child is frightened. You mustn't.
Shut up!
On October 6th, we bounce south again to the US for The Attic, which was directed by George Edwards, a producer that had been in the industry since the 60s, but this was the first and only film he directed. It has Louise here, a depressed librarian, and she's played by the late Carrie Snodgrass, and she's teaching a new intern the ropes, and she lives with her abusive invalid father, who she daydreams about killing. She tells the tale that she was supposed to be married and her groom vanished on her wedding day, and she says it was 19 years ago. So it would have to be when she was a teenager or something, because she really doesn't look that old. And Snodgrass was 35 at the time, but that doesn't mean her character was. We follow her as things seem to unravel, and she has a one-night stand and starts to assert herself with her father, who, by the way, is Ray Milland, film legend who was in Dial M for Murder. Louise buys a monkey and makes sure to dress him in people's clothes, and honestly, most movies are better with chimps in outfits. So one of the more interesting aspects here is that the cinematographer was Gary Graver, who would end up working as a director in the adult industry, but also made several horror flicks, including the extremely perplexing Trick or Treats. Gary claimed that Edwards would oftentimes just up and leave the set and tell him to just continue making the film. And he says that he ended up directing a fair share of it and developed a great working relationship with Snodgrass and ended up putting her in Trick or Treats. Oh, and also this is sort of a sequel to a 1973 film called The Killing Kind, which Edwards also wrote, but didn't direct that one. In it, the characters of Louise and her father are present and they play a smaller role there, but are played by different actors. Frances Bay sneaks in there too, but doesn't sprout any tentacles. And what's wild is that she actually started her film career at 59 years old. Like, she was born in 1919 and made her acting debut in 1978. So if you've only seen her as an old lady, that's why. It's a slow burn into madness and features one of the most hilarious stuntman substitutes of all time. And I'm giving this one a 3 because it is actually a great character study. And it's well made and never dull, but there is a chunk where not much really happens. Its HCS is pretty low though at a 1.5 since it's not really impactful on the world of horror, a little forgotten, and doesn't really establish any careers. Should you watch it? Yeah, I liked this one. I wished it moved maybe slightly faster, but it's worth checking out.
Get him, Dickie.
Next up on October 12th on NBC, Revenge of the Stepford Wives aired. It's set 10 years after the original film, and a family decides to leave the town only to be run off the road by a police car and killed. Cagney comes into town as an investigative reporter doing a piece on Stepford because of their low crime and divorce rate, and she interviews the oddly robotic women that live there. And there's this siren that goes off and they all take pills. She then runs into a new couple in town, Andy and Megan, and Megan may not look familiar, but her voice might be, because this is Marge Simpson right here.
You can afford it. If Andy gets that permanent job, though, we're gonna have to move here.
About a decade after this role, she'd go on to have one of the longest running and well-paying gigs in the industry. It's got Mrs. Roper in it, and oh yeah, Andy is none other than Nash Bridges. And get this movie was released in parts of Europe as Terror in New York, and this is what the poster looked like. And I don't know what movie that this is advertising, but I'm down to watch it, especially since this doesn't even take place in New York. Stepford is in Connecticut. Andy enrolls in their program, and soon Megan is taken through their conversion process. Unlike the original film in which the women were turned into robots, here it appears to be a brainwashing process, and it's essential for them to take the pills to reinforce it. So, this was actually directed by Robert Fewest, who had a pretty solid horror run in the 70s with the Dr. Phibes movies and The Devil's Reign, but by this point in his career had shifted into pretty much only doing TV. Apparently, the lead role was originally intended to be played by Angie Dickinson, but she dropped out shortly before filming. Gless was then brought in at the last minute and accepted the role a mere 1 day before they began shooting. My rating on it is a 2.5. It's watchable, but just kinda repeats the original film without the style and a more upbeat ending. Its HCS is a 2 since it is part of a pretty big, albeit cultish franchise, and has some notable star power in it. Should you watch it? Sure, if you can find it.
But without alcohol, will she do what I want?
Ah, the fraternity guy question. On October 17th, we got a wild entry with Fade to Black from writer-director Vernon Zimmerman, who didn't do a lot of directing, and this was his final feature, but he did write a few more things, and one of those things was Teen Witch.
What's this? Stop that. But give. Stop that. I don't really give a about trying to stop that. Stop that.
It has Eric here, played by Dennis Christopher, who you may remember most as Eddie from the original It, and he loves movies. He also lives with his abusive invalid aunt, which is kind of a theme for this block here, and he works at a distributor. Jack Death is here, as is Whiplash before any of the weird plastic surgery, and Eric becomes obsessed with a Marilyn Monroe look-alike girl he spots at a diner, and she agrees to go out with him. She inadvertently stands him up, which puts him on edge, so when his aunt smashes his projector, he kills her while emulating Kiss of Death. He snaps and begins to retreat into film personas, including Dracula and stalking Marilyn and killing a prostitute. And then, oh my god, is that Wonderbug or Schleppcar? Please, someone get the Wonderbug reference. From then on, he goes down a road of revenge, dressing up as Hopalong Cassidy, and old Fred pops in for like a second. And you know, earlier I commented on how Frances Bay started acting at 59, but John Stedman's got her beat. His first film was in 1970 and he was 61 years old. The film then plays out as a sort of mixture of a psychological descent into madness character study, a slasher flick, and a tribute to the golden age of cinema, with mummy costumes, gangster Tommy guns, and here's an interesting bit. This is actually the film debut of Chris Pine. Well, sorta. This actress is Gwynne Gilford, and during the shoot she was pregnant, and for several shots they had to hide that fact since she began showing. The baby was born not long after filming ended, and that baby was the future Captain Kirk. My rating on this one is a 3.5, almost a 4. It's more like a 3.75. There's just so much cool stuff in this one, even if it starts to get a little one-note at point, and I think that Christopher's performance is a little lacking. Its HCS is a 3, with it being a collection of some top talent and true love of the cinema, and it feels like some sort of a proto-Scream in a way, with a young man taking inspiration from horror films to kill. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's worth it.
Wow, baby! I said, hey, baby.
Our final entry this month is the classic Motel Hell, which arrived in October 18th. It's got Kit Carson as the owner of a motel and has a side business selling smoked meats, but he also has the curious habit of kidnapping people off the road and takes a liking to Terry here. Vincent has a sister in Ballbricker here, and his meats are the rave of the guests, and this was directed by Kevin Connor, who did some classic monster movies from the 70s like The Land That Time Forgot, and after this pretty much went into doing TV shows and movies, and still seems to be active. Vincent also has a little brother who's the town sheriff, and they take Terry in, but here's what the Smiths are up to. It seems that they kidnap those people, remove their vocal cords, and bury them up to their neck in their gardens while a soothing hypnotic music is played. There's also a rock band with Cliff Clavin on drums, and they get planted, and Ira is in on it with him. So this was originally a much darker film and included elements of bestiality, but then was revised to be a bit more of a comedy with a satirical slant. Universal was also in on it for a while, and Tobe Hooper was attached, which would have been interesting considering how much this one gets compared to Texas Chainsaw, but when the studio dropped it, Hooper also left. And although the film appears to be in the middle of a remote rural area, it was actually filmed right outside of Los Angeles, and was surprisingly welcomed by critics at the time. Well, more than usual for this sort of film. Roger Ebert, who was notoriously tough on horror, gave it a great review and lauded its humor, although Leonard Maltin called it stale. Although I'm not sure how you could say that a movie about a brother and sister who have a person garden in their backyard to make homemade meats, while at the same time having a weird four-way love triangle between Vincent, Bruce, Terry, and maybe Ida is stale. Weird S&M couples is stale. Wolfgang Jack as a televangelist is stale. Hypnodiscs to provide a sort of euthanasia, that's stale. Throatless zombie revenge, pig head chainsaw fight, what movie did you watch, Mr. Maltin? Because this is about as stale as the bread that I get from Fiore's Cafe down the road from me, and that is a free plug because that is the best and most fresh damn bread that I have ever had in my entire life. I'm giving this one a 4 because I love this. It's such a wild and unique ride. Sure, it may lean into TCM ever so slightly, but it's way more of its own thing and so much fun. Its significance is a 3.5 because although it's a pretty important film and very well thought of, it's still a bit on the cult side. It didn't do well on release, but it's grown in stature in time. Plus, you remember the Fangoria cover that this was featured on. Should you watch it? Yes. Right now, actually. Just go watch it.
He's got syphilis of the brain. That's right. Oh, he's not normal at all. And he's dumb. Yeah, and his pecker don't work either.
So there you have it. 10 movies from the tail end of 1980, getting closer to the end of the year here. And my favorite in this block is actually pretty easy. It is definitely Motel Hell. Such a great flick and my favorite of this bunch. Although there was some really solid films in this block. I think even the ones that I wasn't that crazy about were still pretty fun to watch. I don't think there was any in this lineup that I was like, oh God, I just don't like this at all. Most pretty good. If you've seen these and enjoy them, let me know down below. Let me know what is your favorite of this batch or which one you most want to see that you haven't seen before. Tell me down below or send me an email to themovietimelines@gmail.com. As always, I would like to thank my patrons for helping keep this channel going and helping to support this project. The 80s Project is very near and dear to me. It's a monthly series, so be prepared to see this again next month. I'm going to keep on doing this until I can't do it anymore. Even if no one is watching this series, I'm still going to continue doing it because that's just how much I love it. So we'll see you very shortly for another episode of the 80s Project.